Hi everyone. We're back again with our series of conversations about the post-COVID era, and we have a very special guest today. We have Michael Sheldrick. Hi, Michael. It's so nice to have you online,
Great.
especially today, even more so than any other day. I think it's very significant that we're having this conversation today. I know you have a lot to share with us, and let me start by introducing you, if that's okay, and then I'll give the word to you.
Sounds great, and it's great to be back with the Bosphorus Summit. I think the last time was end of 2017, when of course we got to do it in person in Istanbul. But I'm glad, even though remotely, we can come together again. It's great.
That is hopefully we'll have you again physically at the Bosphorus Summit as well. Hopefully when things normalize, we'll be physically together as well. So Michael, you're a wonderful person. You're the co-founder and Chief Policy and Government Relations Officer at Global Citizen, and you oversee international advocacy campaigns in support of universal sanitation, climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, access to education, food security, gender equality, disease elimination and prevention. All of this is very significant today, more than any other period that we in our lifetime have gone through. And before we start talking about what's going on in the world right now, I want you to give us a little bit of a background of what Global Citizen is, what it does, and how you started this initiative.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be back at your summit. And can I say that for Global Citizen, we're a global movement. We have millions of members around the world taking action day in, day out. When I say taking action, it's anything from sending an email to tweeting world leaders to volunteering in your community in order to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And for those of you that don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, they are the UN 17-point plan to end extreme poverty, mitigate climate change, and reduce the spread of inequality. So it's the road's blueprint for a more prosperous and sustainable world. But at Global Citizen, I guess the sweet spot for us is what we often call pop and policy. And, the issues we deal with can be very complex, very impenetrable. Even talking about 17 goals can be very hard to get people's attention. And so we're fortunate that over the years, we've been able to work with some of the greatest artists in the world who generously give us our time to help us mainstream this message. And what we say to people, if you take action with us, you can earn points, and you can trade in those points for a reward, a ticket to an event, which we host our own, the Global Citizen Festival. But it's really through this movement, how do we mainstream and also provide a platform for people to take action? And so, we often say action is our currency here at Global Citizen. And so in the last 10 years, we've seen over 20 million actions. We've seen close to $50 billion pledged in response to our campaigns with our partners, and we've seen 880 million lives impacted. But of course, as we're seeing right now with COVID and right here in America, we're seeing a lot of the inequalities that have existed so long being exposed and laying bare for the world to see. And so, my view is this is what the Sustainable Development Goals at its core, it's about equality, right? Equality of opportunity, and that's what we strive to achieve here at Global Citizen.
Yeah, it seems like the voices are more equally being heard. I feel like it's the time when the truth somehow creeps out and reveals itself. So this is a very, very interesting experience for all of us. And before we go into today, again, I want to start by talking about your campaign that you prepared during the Corona pandemic, initially when it started, saying "Together at Home." With Chris Martin, you had all these world celebrities who supported this campaign, and it was a beautiful movement. We thought that brought people from all walks of life together, and it was a very, very strong message of unity, that we're all in this together. How did that come about, and what was the impact that you saw through this campaign?
Yeah, it's funny and it's strange to think we're now here in New York. I mean I've lost count. I think week 12 of the lockdown. But as that was getting started here in New York, but also in other cities around the world, I'm sure there was similar experiences in Turkey and other countries. But we got a call from the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, the United Nations, and they said, look, people are going into lockdown. People are scared. There's a concern around social cohesion rolling over here. And also we need to promote why social distancing is important. And so they said, can you use your artist community to disseminate messages around the importance of social distancing, measures like hand washing, but also for your platform, give people a way to support the global effort, right? Because this is a global challenge. It requires a global solution. And so
you're not in it alone. Everybody's going to.
Exactly. And Chris Martin, who we've worked with for many years, he's our Global Citizen Festival curator, actually since the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. He said, look, why don't I record a virtual concert at home in my living room that I'll promote out on my Instagram to all of my followers. And, it was an organic, impromptu, spur of the moment thing. He then passed the baton to John Legend. By the end of the week, you had Shawn Mendes and Camila Cabello. And then before you know it, it steamrolled into this huge, train of artists all around the world, I should say. Now,
even artists in Turkey, they were interested to participate.
Exactly. All around, it was literally a global effort. And then so on April 18, we rolled it all together. We had a 6-hour digital show and then a 2-hour broadcast show, to stand in solidarity with health workers. And really at its core, I think that event came at a time when people around the world needed solidarity. And I think the frontline health workers who were the true heroes in that effort. I mean, even here in New York, the stories of courage, health workers going in day out, coming home to their families, often self-isolating because they didn't know if they had it and didn't want to infect. So I hope in a small way, we helped contribute to that effort. And of course, we raised 128 million US dollars, which went towards, providing PPE, providing tests, providing, essentials at the time. But it was crazy. And you know what the amazing thing about that endeavor is? Everyone did it virtually from their homes, the artists, the producers. I mean, I haven't seen any of my colleagues, with the exception of one of my co-founders who lives downstairs, but that's a separate story. But I haven't seen any of them in months now. And for me as well, I actually we didn't know it was COVID at the time, but 3 weeks before the show, we had our producers call. We had just briefed Lady Gaga. It was the day after our first call with her. And I started getting a fever. I got chills. I got muscle aches. So I was out of it for about 10 days, but we've got an extraordinary team, who just worked so hard. They threw their heart and soul and pulled it all together. And, I guess for my part, it was extraordinary to see, New York as it was at other places in the world. It was a scary time. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and many people were sick, myself included.
You went through it as well. Yeah, you went through the disease as well in the midst of all of this. But that had a very, very strong note of hope for humanity. And we actually saw everyone come together and everyone seemed aligned. But when I look at what's happening today, it doesn't seem as aligned. It seems like there's a division of opinions. There's a division of points of view. From that kind of beautiful getting together, which was, again, your message to the world, together at home, now we seem to see a split. And it's a split that is not desired because there is no reason to have a split. Everybody's actually aiming for a better future. Everybody's looking for more security. Everybody's looking for more human rights. Everybody's looking for, less violence. But it seems to be, going the opposite directions. Please share your views on this.
Yeah, I mean, and it's certainly at the government and global level, and what I would say institutional level. A colleague said to me yesterday is we're seeing the failure of governance, or we're seeing the failure of systems and people. What happened last week with the assault on George Floyd, that tragic assault that led to one man's death, and has ignited this movement around really the globe. I think it's a global reaction. That is the same failure in systems that we are also seeing why people can't access basic healthcare in much of the world, which disproportionately impacts marginalized communities. So I think what we're seeing in 2020 year is the year of really, it's exposing how systems fail to respond to people, how governance, how our institutions are ill-equipped to provide access to healthcare or access to justice. That's what we're really seeing. But this has existed for decades, even centuries. If you look at what's happening in America, I think the difference is in 2020, people are saying they've had enough. And you're seeing this bubble up. But even in healthcare, 20 odd 30 years ago, we saw many people die from HIV/AIDS in parts of the world, even when drugs were available. Drugs were available and people couldn't afford them in developing countries because people wanted to profit out of it. So you're seeing, history rhymes. We're seeing that play out in front of us. But for our part at Global Citizen, we're an organization that, believes in equality of opportunity. So we're campaigning for everyone to have access to test, treatments, and a vaccine once it's created, as we also call out racism too. But that's really what we're seeing. But on the flip side, I think, if we're seeing the failure of our institutions exposed, and you're seeing the tensions, you're seeing this with the World Health Organization as well,
Yes.
We need American leadership, of course, in the global response. You're seeing the back and forth. I think, and I can say this as an organization with citizen in the name, but I think it's to citizens that we should look for the response. If this is the failure of institutions to meet the needs of people, I think, it's people that are going to stand up and address this. That is my hope. And what you're seeing here in America today is hundreds of thousands, millions of young people across this country stand up and say enough is enough. And I think, maybe what can come out of this is a renewed sense of civil society, people organizing and holding leaders accountable for the change they want to see. And so I think, what you are seeing, and even the reaction to what is going on in America, the global response, protests in London, protests in Berlin. I mean, this is people standing in solidarity. And another of my colleagues said yesterday, an injustice against one global citizen is an injustice against all global citizens. And so I think the fact you're seeing such a global reaction is encouraging, that people are saying, it doesn't matter if you're in a different country, you're my brother, you're my sister, and we need to stand up for that.
Yes, this is a beautiful way of expressing it. And I also want you to comment a little bit, because a lot of the people that I talk to as well, there seems to be a confusion of the protesters and the looters, right? So there's both sides, and it seems to be creating some sort of a confusion in many people's heads, especially those who maybe see these protests as not so positive, because there's a whole sense of rioting and looting that puts in danger the security of civilians as well. Maybe you can explain the difference a little bit so it becomes clear what you stand for.
Well, I think overwhelmingly, the protests, are people wanting to voice their concern. They're people who want to see a change in these systems. And frankly, I think we can talk about, the violence, that you referred to. And of course, we condone violence of any kind. But I think, what they're also saying, many of these protests, is they're condoning you know, not just decades, but centuries of you know, brutality and racism and frankly violence that they've suffered. And so I think they're right to call that out. I think they're right to take to the streets and exercise their right to a voice, as is, you know, what we're seeing around the world. But I think, you know, I'm not an American citizen. I'm from a different part of the world. I'm a visitor here, but I've, you know, made it my home over the last few years, as have many of my colleagues. And I've taken it upon myself to actually, you know, try and understand the history of this country. You know, I've read books. There's a great book called Gilles Lepore, called These Truths, which I read last year. And it really is fantastic. And it will show you how, even before the birth of the United States, how racism, you know, was part of it. People tend to think of two eras, the Civil War. They tend to think of the Civil Rights Movement. But actually, you know, if you go back to even before, you know, the birth of this nation, when Thomas Jefferson was sat on the shores of a river writing the Declaration of Independence, he pondered, you know, do we call out the hypocrisy of slavery? And there were people, you know, particularly from Virginia and the other colleagues that said, oh, we're not going to touch that. And allegedly, when George Washington was elected president of the United States, on his inauguration speech, he was allegedly given two speeches. One he threw into the fire, the other he gave, but it's alleged that the one he threw in the fire would actually have had him release his slaves on the day of his inauguration as the nation's first president. So this tension goes back, and I think you're seeing it bubble up because it hasn't fully been addressed, but the roots are in centuries old history, which is not unique to America. Other countries, including my own of Australia, has its own demons, as I'm sure is the case in Turkey and other countries that we have to wrestle with and confront. Yeah.
Yeah, inequality is an issue in every part of the world. I mean, even in Africa, even within Africa itself. And you know, Africa. I lived in Africa. Even within Africa, we see inequality within the Africans as well. So it's not something that is always a matter of it's happening there and it's not happening here. It's in the minds of people. So it's about shifting that mindset, which is very difficult to achieve, it seems. But what are your, as global citizen, do you foresee any movements, any action that you'll be taking in the near future to maybe help out in changing the minds of people, or the institutions, making sure they will function in a better way?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Firstly, you know, as long as this pandemic goes on, it's going to affect the ability of economies to function again. It's going to affect the ability of countries and communities to return to normal. And as long as that happens, who are the people who hurt the most? It's marginalized communities. It's marginalized communities who are the first to lose their jobs. It's marginalized communities who, when they get sick, can't access, or in some cases are denied, the basic health treatment that some of us can take for granted and rely on. So step one is we've got to address this pandemic. And the only way we're going to address this pandemic is by ensuring that tests, treatments, and vaccines are made available to everyone, everywhere who needs it. And that's why last Thursday, we launched a campaign in partnership with the European Commission called Global Goal Unite for Our Future, which is a month-long campaign which will culminate in a summit on June 27th. We've got some of the biggest artists supporting it, from Lady Gaga to Miley Cyrus, Idris and Sabrina Alba, you know, backing it. But the idea is to raise the billions needed to end this pandemic and also limit its impact on poorer countries and marginalized communities. So that's what we need to do, because everyone is hurting, and already it's estimated that 50 to 60 million people have been pushed back into extreme poverty as a result of this pandemic. So we are certainly supporting that. We think it requires a global response, and I invite all the countries, corporates, philanthropists that might be watching this show right now. to join us on June 27th and bring a contribution towards the equitable distribution of test treatments and vaccines. In terms of the broader issue around, what we're seeing right now in America, myself and our colleagues, we're currently looking at, the organizations that are doing fantastic work here on the ground. Many of them have been campaigning around these issues for many years, many decades, and we're looking at how we can best support their work and lift them up. And we'll certainly be sending out a statement to all of our global citizens here in America later today about what they can do, and we'll be posting on our website what people can do if they want to get involved in this response we're seeing right now. Because for us, it comes back to equality of opportunity. Yes. And it's about access to health, it's about access to justice, and protection of life. Fundamentally, it's about the right to life. Yeah.
No, it's beautiful that you're actually taking solid action, because there are a lot of people who will talk and who will create awareness, but then there's no action. So it's beautiful that a global citizen is actually taking action, and it's wonderful for us to be able to reveal this, and we'll definitely be of support to you from this part of the world as well.
I was going to say, your point about awareness, we banned that phrase, awareness raising that global citizen.
It's a dangerous word, isn't it?
Well, it's like, if you're doing something to raise awareness, what are you raising awareness of? Of the problem? Or does the problem, how many people already know of the problem? So why aren't you focusing on the solution? So that's why, as I said earlier, we always say action is our currency, and we try and bring it back. Okay, in what way are we actually meaningfully contributing? That's what we always ask ourselves. But for our involvement, what would happen? How can we make an impact and contribute here?
Yes, actually, can you tell us the story, because I love that story of how you actually started all of this back in Australia with polio. It's the most inspiring story, and I would love whoever is watching us to hear the story from you directly.
Yeah, and it's funny it was around polio, because a lot of that, we campaign around multiple things. Sure. But it is slightly strange that the very first campaign we ever did as an organization related to a different virus, given what this year's all been about. But for those of your viewers who may not be aware what polio is, it is a virus, much like what we're seeing with COVID-19. It was a viral disease. And you go back 60, 70 years ago, it was very infectious. Even in wealthy countries like America and in Europe, saw huge infections. You're talking tens of thousands. And the thing about polio is it was a debilitating disease, it's still around, that at its worst could paralyze young children and leave them, frankly, paralyzed for life. There were images I saw as I was researching for the campaign of hundreds of children in wards, hospital wards, with what was called these ghastly iron lungs, which would assist them to breathe because their own breathing apparatus had collapsed. And how we got involved in this campaign is, I was a student in Perth, Australia, and as Global Citizen was getting started, we started campaigning around these issues of poverty. We realized that we needed a story that really showed progress, showed what was possible against extreme poverty. Because when you talk about poverty, it can seem an abstract concept, unless you're living in poverty, if you're not there, if you're not seeing it. And the thing with polio is many people could still remember it. Many people are still around. And I remember learning about polio from a friend. I went to a Rotary club in Perth. Rotary has been at the forefront of this effort for decades. And I met this man who people had pointed me to and said, if you want to hear about polio, speak to this man, David Goldstone. And I remember I sat opposite him and asked him, can you share me what it was like to see polio? And David at the time was in his late 70s. And he told me a story about growing up in Sydney. And one day his friend John was 21, walking down the terrace in Sydney and just collapsed. And when John woke up in the hospital, he was told, you will never walk again. That was the first thing the chief medical officer said. And John was so determined, he said, yes, I will. David recounted to me in that conversation how John slowly over time regained the use of his limbs. He taught himself how to walk, but he still had a limp. He couldn't, when his kids or later grandkids tried to say, "Daddy, Granddad, can you lift me up?" He said, "No, I can't." But he was able to be a successful businessman, and he was able to give back and contribute to polio. And at the end of that conversation, I noticed David, he had a slight tear in his eye. His eyes were watery. And he had gotten through the whole story, given me, you know, and I'm summarizing it, but giving me intimate detail of this man's life who had had polio. And he said, "Sorry, I've been telling you a lie." And I said, what do you mean it's not true? What do you mean a lie? And he said, "It's just very hard." And I'll never forget when David pulled out the chair next to me, put his leg on that chair, lifted up his trouser leg, and revealed a caliper to assist him to walk. And he looked at me and he said, "It wasn't John who collapsed all those years ago. It was me."
Oh my
And I
God.
don't need anyone's charity or generosity. I just want us to get out and bloody well end this disease once and for all.
Yeah.
And so with that, we didn't have much, but there was a summit taking place in Perth, Australia later that year, bringing together all of the Commonwealth leaders, and it was being hosted by our first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. And, you know, I guess I was student activist. You know, I would knock on doors until I would get in and to see the right person. And somehow, I mean, it's a long story, I won't bore your viewers, but I found myself face to face with Julia Gillard for 15 minutes when she was making an education announcement. And I remember I had rehearsed my speech. I was like, you know, if you've got 15 minutes with the most powerful person in the country, how do you not screw it up? And I said, told her about the story of polio. I shared her David's story. And she told me, "I'm very interested to help and make this a key event at this summit I'm hosted, but I need some help." And what she meant is, at the end of the day, we can't always blame politicians, because we as taxpayers and citizens need to give them permission to spend what is in the end our money. And
Right.
so just like that, I said, what about if we did this concert on the eve of that, you know, that we would galvanize people, we would shine the spotlight on this issue, which would give you a public mandate. And she said, "Well, if you can do that, we've got a deal." And several months later, we found ourselves with this event. We convinced John Legend to come to Perth. Many people were involved. And I'll never forget that announcement with Julia Gillard. She had the Prime Minister of the UK, then President of Nigeria, Pakistan, Prime Minister of Canada. And I just remember walking out and turning to her, said, "You know, we made a deal and I kept my word, and more to the point, you kept your word. And here we are, we're changing the world." And she put her hand on my shoulder, probably as if to say, "Oh, you know, you're very cute." But it was off the back of that, we got our first multi-year grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. 9 months later, we were standing in Central Park for the first ever Global Citizen Festival. But yeah, it's amazing. I had forgotten a lot of the detail, but this campaign against COVID-19, you know, we look at to history as what's been successful. And all I would say is the polio eradication program is I got to play a small role that year in what is and still is called one of the largest non-violent movements of people the world has ever seen. And through that, they've reached communities everywhere. They reached communities that were faceless, that were neglected, that no one even knew existed for the first time with a health vaccine. It was the ultimate test of social justice, because if you couldn't reach every single kid with the basic vaccine, how can you talk about justice? How can you talk about ending extreme poverty? And so for me, I still look to that as a formative moment in my growth as a campaigner, and just still continuing inspired by many of the heroes that worked on that campaign.
Beautiful. It's one of the most inspiring stories I've ever heard. And you know, that's why it is beautiful to support you in every way that we can. And what I hear a lot in this story is that, first of all, you know, we always think, how can I create change? But one person can actually make a difference. That's for sure. If you intend to, you can make a difference. So that's an important message to give out. And another thing is, like you said, you know, we always blame politicians of not, you know, maybe performing as we expect them to. But most of the time, they do depend on civilians and the approval of the public as well. So to speak, it's not always them and not doing and us asking, but it's about that collaboration, because at the end of the day, they need our approval and they need our support and maybe sometimes our guidance to be able to create change as well. So I think this and how art has played around with this, how music and how art supported this movement is a beautiful example of how we can create change in the world. And playing on that, I want to ask, because I'm getting some questions from the viewers as well, I want to ask the opposite story, or the opposite question, because they're asking about how there's especially Trump that accuses WHO for not revealing the truth about this COVID-19 when it first emerged in China. And if they had warned, they say, the US or Europe beforehand, maybe better measures could be taken. So you work closely with WHO, with the World Health Organization. How would you give an explanation to that question?
Yeah, look, I think the World Health Organization is the first to say, you know, that they're not perfect and that they need to do more. And I think there will be lessons from this. And almost every country has said that there should be a point to review this, right? There should be a point where we look back and say, what did we get wrong? We need to work on these lessons in order to ensure we don't have a repeat of this pandemic. But what I would say is, when you're in the time of crisis, right, you focus on putting out the houses that are burning, the houses that are on fire. And in this case, the only way we're going to end this pandemic is frankly by ensuring that test treatments, vaccines are made available to everyone everywhere, about ensuring that no country gets left behind. Because what we've already seen, so long as the virus remains anywhere, it is a threat everywhere. And the WHO is the only organization with a global mandate equipped to respond to this in all countries. So, you know, can it do better? Can we all do better? Yes. Will there be time for reflection? Yes. But that doesn't mean we should strip our support and go it alone, because in the past, and it's not just in health, but any other crisis, when countries go it alone, is usually when we end up making the problem worse. You only have to look at what happened with the Great Depression, the protectionist measures that sprang up, you know, as to the consequences of the idea, let's do this alone. And so, you know, we need to address this. We need leadership. You know, Australia has been calling for reviews of the WHO as well, but that doesn't mean that they're withdrawing funding. So my hope is, you know, even as they cut off funding to the WHO, which is disappointing to many of us, I hope we can still count on American leadership, you know, to invest in all the other organizations that are supporting the supply and distribution of tests, treatments, and vaccines to people everywhere, with priority given to frontline health workers and those most vulnerable to the virus. Yeah.
So yes, very good point. Instead of isolating them, let's try to make it better. And if you isolate them, then there's no other institution that can take on that role anyway at the moment.
And the point I would make to the WHO is they have for years said that they are woefully underfunded to respond to any kind of pandemic. I mean, Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, 3 years ago in 2017, I stood on a cardboard box with him at the Tenement Museum in downtown Manhattan. And the reason why we did that is the Tenement Museum and the tenements were the scene in the mid-19th century of the big cholera outbreaks, which unsurprisingly affected the most vulnerable, right? Cholera, one of the biggest plagues and killers at the time of children under the age of 5. And I stood on this cardboard box with Tedros. We had a sea of people there that had turned out for this event. You know, we were there wasn't much social distance in there. We were all jammed together like sardines. But Dr. Tedros said, we are 10 minutes to midnight against the emergence of a dangerous pandemic. You know, he has said that since day one, and the WHO has been woefully underfunded. For the last few years, they actually only had a third of what they needed to respond to outbreaks. And already at the end of last year, that was already drawn down because they had responded to the emergence of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this is an organization that was already under strain, that already wasn't getting the support we needed. So before leaders point the finger, you know, I think as part of the analysis to say what went wrong, we need to look back the last few years and say our ability to respond to this pandemic didn't occur, you know, wasn't set in stone, you know, over the last few months. This was written over the last few years, and here in America, probably the last few decades of underinvestment in a healthcare system, which means that you now have 1 in 3 African Americans, you know, getting the virus because of decades of the inequities when it comes to access to healthcare. So you can look across all of this, but, you know, ultimately the best way to prepare for any pandemic is to have strong healthcare systems. And so I hope coming off the back of this, countries will realize, much like you prepare for war, regardless of, you know, the circumstances of your economy, you also need to prepare, you know, for a pandemic, you know, long before there is one, and that is investing in healthcare in all countries. It shouldn't be a discretionary option or, you know, thing we do when the times are good. It should be something we recognize as vital and something we need to do, you know, around the clock.
And available to everybody, obviously. That is
Exactly.
a very important point.
That's the core.
Yeah, that is the core. Do you see that happening? Do you see it becoming available for everyone? Do you see that change happening in your future?
I've been encouraged in some of the stimulus measures that have been passed, but they have included provision for healthcare. And I think countries you're seeing an upsurge in healthcare spending, but that needs to be sustained. I hope we can have that paradigm shift. You know, frankly, also needs to happen on climate change and the many other issues. I hope there's a recognition that if we don't pay early, right, we're going to pay more later. And we're seeing that, you know, the cost of this pandemic to this economy is probably going to run into the trillions, right? You know, and so we are seeing that. And so I hope leaders will say, well, the prudent thing to do for our own security and the right thing to do is to invest in this. And treat it in the same way we treat military expenditure and all the other things we deem as essential. But the other flip side that I would say is, you know, we know that public financing is likely not going to be sufficient to finance, you know, the recovery and to get back on track to achieving the SDGs. Already before this year, it was almost a nearly impossible task, you know, for countries to meet their obligations to the world's poorest countries. You know, deficits are in abundance. You know, countries are racking up debt. You know, they've got their own issues. They should be making this a priority. But I think what this pandemic underscores is the need for private wealth, private capital to also step in. And so it was funny, I was in Davos. One of the last international trips I took was to Davos, the World Economic Forum. Yeah. And we launched a campaign called Give While You Live, calling, even before this all happened, calling on those of us who are the most fortunate to actually spend down their wealth and contribute to realizing the goals, because ultimately, as the pandemic has shown, it's in their interest. You know, look at the impact this has had on the economy. And I would say, have I seen some of it? You know, during the Together at Home, you know, of that 128 million, we saw many individual philanthropists stepping up. We've engaged with a number of philanthropists we had never come across or engaged. But, you know, that's just the start. And 128 million is great for the immediate response, but it's going to take tens of billions of dollars just to end this pandemic and distribute vaccines. And so we need that to continue, and it needs to be at a far greater level. And so, you know, yes, I've seen, you know, some, I guess, signs that we are recognizing a paradigm shift, but we need that to be sustained, and we need it to continue into the future for the next 10 years. And also we need, frankly, you know, it needs to be at 5%. Foundations and others, you know, that have their wealth, they need to be granting that out at least 5% a year. They can't be holding it into an account and just accumulating the interest. That needs to change. Yeah,
that needs to change as well. And do you think there's more of a participation with global citizen, and for this purpose from the Western world, or do you think there's kind of an equal participation from all around the world? How do you see it? How do you see the balance in that sense?
For global citizens campaigns,
Yes.
or in general, just so I make sure I
First,
understand
global
the question.
citizen, and then in general, how do you see it? What have you observed in your own experience, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, for global citizen, and it was great actually. We saw this through. Excuse me. We saw this through together at home. You know, it's funny. Before the pandemic happened, we had already launched a campaign that was meant to culminate on September 26th this year, called Global Goal Live: The Possible Dream. And the idea behind it was to mark the 5th anniversary of the Sustainable Development Goals, and launch this decade of action. And, you know, it was taken 35 years after Live Aid, right? And Live Aid took place in Philadelphia and London. And what we said is we wanted this to be truly global. And, you know, when those events took place in 1985, it was also about wealthy countries donating to poorer countries. And what we said is we wanted this to be truly global and about people movement, because it's going to take movements of people everywhere holding their leaders accountable if we're going to change the systems that keep people poor, right? If we recognize this is a systemic issue. And so before all of this, we were set for a continental wide series of concerts, all to take place the same day in countries that we were engaging with for the first time: in Mexico City, in Nigeria, in Korea, in the United Arab Emirates. And you know what was great? These countries were coming to us asking how they could get involved, and that they wanted to be part of the global citizen movement. They were already part of the global citizen movement, but they wanted to stand in solidarity with what we were doing with other countries. And so even though we've had to postpone that until next year, a lot of the, I guess, infrastructure and networks through that campaign meant that when we did together at home, we were able to rely on our partners in Mexico, in Korea, in Nigeria, and we were able to ensure that this, trended number one in those countries. Engaging in countries like Brazil, where we've never had a presence, and it was trended number one, right around the world. And so for us at Global Citizen, I actually think it's funny. We were meant to do that in September. The pandemic actually caused us to do that in April. So it actually brought, fast forwarded the clock, because it was what was needed. And that will continue for us as the title of our current campaign is called. It's called Global Goal Unite for Our Future, right? It's in the name. Globally, I think, we've spoken about some of the tensions we're seeing amongst countries, amongst institutions, which is why we have to rely on people. And, countries, it may be difficult for countries, people to travel between countries. We're seeing, some degrees of cooperation in some areas, not in others. But what I can tell you is, amongst artists, civil society, community, my day is full of Zoom calls, WebExes, speaking with activists around the world. And activists get it. People get it fundamentally, that we can't do this so long as someone somewhere is left behind. Like that, people seem to get that so long as the virus remains everywhere, it's a threat everywhere. Like, people seem to get that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Our leaders may not get that, but people certainly do. And so we are, through our global citizen movement, we're harnessing that. We're giving people a way to take action. But I think there are still things people can do, even if their leaders choose not to listen.
Yes. And so then, what is the message or the lesson here? Because COVID obviously has made us stop and made us think and rethink and redesign and reimagine, right? So what do you think, first of all, will there be a change post-COVID? Are we going to go through a change as humanity? If so, what kind of a change? And what are the lessons, in your opinion, that we have learned, if any?
Yeah. I think it's honestly too early to start talking about the lesson from COVID-19. And the reason why I say that is, and someone said this to me the other week, someone that's actually working at the forefront of developing a vaccine, is usually when the history books are written about crises, they tend to focus on, as much as how the crisis began, it's also about how the crisis was resolved and what ended, right? You look at the First World War, we tend to talk about it now in terms of the failure to ensure that it was the war to end all wars, you know, the war to guarantee peace, you know, the League of Nations that came out of that, the precursor to the United Nations collapsed. The Second World War, you know, the leaders, as part of that, they got it right. For the first time after that war, unprecedented, I think, in history, you know, the Allies realized that they needed to embrace Germany. They needed to invest in Japan to rebuild. They needed to embrace their former enemies, and they rebuilt, you know, the League of Nations in the United Nations, right? And you had decade-long series of peace, arguably globally, around the world, right? So there's lessons you can take. So I think with COVID-19, when we look back in 10, 20 years' time, you know, the question, I would flip your question as, what lesson do we want people to take from this crisis, right? We can take the lesson that happens, and we've seen it throughout history. And sadly, COVID-19 just becomes another example of what happens when countries try and do it alone. Doesn't work. Or, you know, this could be an example of actually countries coming together, cooperating to ensure that once a vaccine was found, we made sure that everyone on the planet received one, starting with frontline health workers and the most vulnerable. And we can make that the lesson from this crisis, that for the first time ever, we start with those who need it, not those who want it just because they have lots of money. You know, that's the lesson we can take from this. And if that is the lesson, then, you know, this year was always meant to kick off a decade of action. Then maybe there is something good that can come from this, that can inspire and catalyze a decade of action around the Sustainable Development Goals. And that lesson can be taken to climate change, other areas where we realize that only, you know, it's in all of our interests to work together to address this. So I guess I don't have the immediate lesson from this, but I know what lesson I want us to be able to take from it, but it's going to require us stepping up in the next few months and calling on our leaders to step up as well. Yeah.
Beautifully explained. And it is so interesting that you started by comparing what we're going through to World War I and World War II, and those were wars that divided the whole world, right? Whereas this is our opportunity, maybe as humanity, to, like you say, flip it and turn it into a collaboration. Instead of a division, a collaboration, a world collaboration. This could be the turning point for the entire humanity if we do this right. But very strong, how can I say, very difficult task to achieve because first of all, countries are not used to this. Politicians' mindsets I think are not prepared for this. We've always been prepared for wars and for fighting each other and for discrepancies, and now we're trying to give it a very different turn. Maybe that's why right now more responsibility falls onto the shoulders of people like yourself, and you know, maybe that's why artists are speaking up even more than ever. Do you see hope in that, or do you think it's going to go back to the old ways? You personally, how do you see it?
I mean, it is hard to achieve it, right? Like, and you know, we're talking about history. You know, a lot of people have been asking me about questions around what it takes to develop a vaccine. And the thing I point out is, well, look, they first developed a vaccine against smallpox over 300 years ago, right? Catherine the Great in Russia was getting a smallpox vaccine, and yet it took until 1980 for us to eradicate that. So just focusing on science provides part of the solution, but it's not the complete picture. you look at HIV/AIDS, many people died needlessly, even when drugs existed, because they weren't able to afford them. They weren't accessible. And I think, you know, to your question, do I have hope? You know, I started, you know, this debate by talking about polio, right? And I think when I look back at the lessons of polio, I'm reminded of the guy who invented the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk, who, you know, was famously asked who owned the patent on the vaccine. Mm. And he said, looked at the interviewer confused, and he said, well, what do you mean? The people own the patent on this vaccine. And he pondered, can you patent the sun? And, you know, what happened then with that virus, that vaccine against polio virus, you know, was extraordinary. It did take decades, you know, in order to do it. And it still remains in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But the fact we've removed polio as a public health threat, eradicated it by almost 99.9%, you know, that in itself shows that this can be done. Mm-hmm. However, you know, we don't have decades with this virus. We've got to compress all of those lessons and try and do something unthinkable. That is to develop a vaccine in the next 2 years and then figure out a way to equitably allocate it to 7+ billion people on the planet. But I think, you know, the lessons are there that suggest it can be done. Yeah.
That is a beautiful way we're almost at the end of our time as well. It's a beautiful note to end it. But I want you to give one final message to people, to every single person who might be listening to us right now. What is one message you would give out to them on how to prepare for this new era that we're finding ourselves in? Because this is a very different setting than what we have been used to. So our normal has changed radically and kind of overnight. So what kind of a message would you give out to them so they feel more prepared?
Yeah, I would say try not to wait for others to ask you to get involved. Ask you what you can do right now. I say this in the context of the current protests taking place here in America. You know, many of my colleagues, Black colleagues and others have said how frustrated they are that people are asking them to educate them on why this is a big issue, You know, educate yourself about the history of that. Take the time to learn that. You know, more broadly, you know, look at what you can do. Maybe it's, you know, writing an email to your local leader. Maybe it's getting a group of friends together, you know, virtually, and asking them what we can do. But do something, and don't put the burden of action on others. Don't make it about ticking a box. Take responsibility for identifying what you can do, and then go out and do it. But don't place, we all have a responsibility, and don't place that burden on someone else to do the hard yards of thinking what you should do for you. Yeah.
Beautiful message. We always expect from outside, but sometimes we as individuals have to take responsibility for what our reality is. Michael, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but unfortunately, our time is up, and you have our full support, and we'll definitely be collaborating.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me once again participate. I know it's a different way of doing it, but I do look forward. You know, I love the people of Turkey and in Istanbul. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. So I do hope at some point we can do this all again in person at some point in the future. Maybe then you can ask me the question about what lessons we can take from COVID-19, and I can have a positive answer for you.
I hope we'll refer back to this and we'll see that, yes, you were right. We had a positive outcome. Let's hope for it. Thank you, Michael, and all the best.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you. Bye.